The voice in my head told me to cut my safety harness and fall out of the helicopter, so I unclipped. It was May 14th, 1968, high over the dense, suffocating green hell of the Ah Valley. I was 19 years old, sitting on the edge of a UH-1 Huey floorboards with my legs dangling over 3,000 feet of empty air. My fingers were locked around the spades of an M60 machine gun, my harness hooked tightly to the center anchor bolt on the roof of the bird. In a doorsicle like that, your harness is your life. You don't unclip. If the pilot banks hard to dodge an enemy rocket, centrifugal force will throw you into the cloud cover before you can even scream. We were flying low-level combat assault, escorting 3 slick transports into an extraction zone that had gone completely sour. The radios were screaming with overlapping frantic calls. An infantry platoon from the 101st Airborne was pinned down in a riverbed, taking heavy fire from 3 sides.
The jungle below was spitting green tracers into the gray sky, a blinding display of anti-aircraft fire that chewed through the belly of anything flying under 500 feet. My pilot, Captain Miller, was leaning forward in his armor-plated seat, shouting over the intercom, pushing the turbine for every ounce of airspeed. I was laying down suppressive bursts, burning through belt after belt of 7.62 ammo. The heat coming off my M60 was searing through my leather gloves. Spent brass casings were bouncing off the metal floorboards like burning hail, raining out the open bay door into the canopy below. Then, the world seemed to slow down to an agonizing crawl. It wasn't a tactical radio transmission, it wasn't Captain Miller, and it wasn't my crew chief behind me. It was a voice that echoed inside my skull, crisp, calm, and utterly devoid of panic. It didn't bounce through the wires of my helmet's internal comms. It sounded as if someone were standing directly behind me, putting a hand on my collar and speaking right into my ear over the deafening roar of the main rotor blades. "Unclip the buckle, Vance. Step off the floor." I ignored it. In combat, your brain plays tricks on you. The human auditory nerve cooks under that kind of stress. You hear music in the engine noise. You hear voices in the wind. I shoved my boots harder against the skid, leaned into the rubber iPad of the gun sight, and fired another long, sweeping burst into a tree line where a heavy-caliber machine gun was muzzle flashing. 2 seconds later, the voice returned, but this time it wasn't just a suggestion. It was an absolute physical command that rattled my teeth. Unclip now. Jump back. An overwhelming urge, completely contrary to every instinct trained into me, seized my limbs. My hand didn't move because I told it to. It moved like a violent reflex, as if I'd touched a red-hot stove. My left hand shot down to my waist, slapped the quick-release buckle of my safety harness, and popped the steel clasp. At that exact millisecond, I yanked my legs back off the landing skids and threw my entire body backward onto the aluminum floor of the cargo bay, dragging the crew chief down with me by his flak jacket. A split second later, a 12.7mm heavy anti-aircraft round smashed through the open door right where my chest had been half a breath before. The projectile didn't just pass through, it struck the steel mounting arm of my M60 machine gun, detonating the ready box of ammunition lined up beside it. The explosion tore the gun clean off its swivel mount, shattering the metal into jagged shrapnel that shredded the frame of my seat. The concussion knocked the breath out of my lungs, filling the cabin with white smoke, burning powder, and flying brass. If I had been strapped into that harness, if my legs had been resting on that skid, my torso would have been severed in two. We're hit, rotor failure," Captain Miller screamed over the blaring caution alarms. The tail rotor had taken a secondary hit from the blast fragments. The Huey lurched violently, pitching forward into a terrifying, sickening auto-rotation. The world outside the open door became a spinning blur of blue sky and blinding jungle green.
The G-force slammed me against the back bulkhead. I reached out, frantically grabbing onto the tie-down rings on the deck, watching my destroyed M60 tumble into the blue abyss below. Tree branches began tearing at the belly of the craft. The sound was like 1,000 sheet metal shears ripping apart at once. The skids caught the top of the canopy, flipping the airframe sidewards before we smashed through the upper layer of palm fronds and plunged into the darkness beneath the forest floor. The crash was a deafening crunch of metal, fiberglass, and snapping timber. Then, absolute silence. I lay in the mud, surrounded by the smell of crushed leaves, hot hydraulic fluid, and burning aviation fuel. The Huey was broken in half behind the main transmission, resting on its side in a small, unmapped clearing at the bottom of a ravine.
Miraculously, Captain Miller and the co-pilot were alive, trapped in their armored seats, but breathing. The crew chief was unconscious beside me, but his chest was moving. My head was spinning, my ears ringing with a pitch so high it felt like glass breaking inside my head. I unbuckled my emergency sidearm, a .45 caliber pistol, and crawled out through the shattered windshield frame into the wet, hot mud of the jungle floor. We were miles off course. The spinning plunge had carried us far away from the primary extraction zone. Tactical logic dictated that we form a perimeter around the wreckage, stay hidden in the thick underbrush, and wait for a search and rescue bird to locate our emergency beacon. Moving through enemy-controlled terrain without a rifle was suicide. Yet, the moment my feet touched the mud, that same strange, unexplainable pull took hold of me again. It wasn't a voice this time. It was a physical sensation, like a heavy iron thread hooked into my chest, pulling me toward a thick wall of elephant grass 30 yards away at the edge of the clearing.
Every tactical rule in the manual said stay with the aircraft. The jungle beyond that grass was dark, silent, and crawling with enemy patrols. I took a step forward. Captain Miller yelled from the cockpit, his voice weak and slurred. "Vance, what are you doing? Get back here! Cover the tree line!" I couldn't answer him. I couldn't explain why my legs were moving. I pulled my pistol, stepped over a fallen bamboo trunk, and pushed my way through the thick, razor-sharp blades of the elephant grass. The silence of the jungle was heavy, suffocating. The air smelled of damp earth and blood. 10 yards into the brush, I found a trail of fresh red droplets splashed across the broad leaves. I dropped to one knee, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The iron pull in my chest grew stronger, practically dragging me forward down a narrow game trail that wound down toward a shallow creek bed. Then I heard it, a ragged, wet gasp for air coming from under a tangle of wild banana leaves. I raised my pistol, rounding the root ball of a massive mahogany tree, expecting to see an enemy soldier lying in wait. Instead, I saw a crumpled figure wearing a torn, mud-caked U.S. Army uniform. His helmet was gone. His uniform bore the patch of the 101st Airborne, the very unit we had been trying to support miles away. He had been separated from his squad during the initial ambush, chased through the ravine by ground fire, and hit twice in the thigh. He had crawled into the hollow of the tree roots to bleed to death in the dark. He was pale, his skin cold and clammy, his hands trembling violently as he fumbled with an empty M16 magazine. I dropped my pistol, fell to my knees, and grabbed his shoulder to roll him over so I could access his wounds. "Hang on, son," I grunted, pulling my field medical kit from my web belt. "I've got you. Just lay back." The soldier blinked, his vision unfocused, mud caked in his eyelids. He looked up at me, his cracked lips moving without sound for a long, agonizing second. Then his eyes widened. "Jim," he whispered. My hands froze on the buckle of my medical pouch. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. I wiped the mud and sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of my fatigue shirt. Beneath the dirt, beneath the pallor of shock and blood loss, was a face I had known my entire life. It was my younger brother, Tommy.
Tommy was 19 years old. As far as my family was concerned, as far as every letter from home had told me, Tommy was supposed to be sitting behind a supply desk in an administrative depot in Saigon, 300 miles to the south. He had never told me, never told our parents, that he had volunteered for an infantry transfer 2 weeks prior. He had wanted to prove himself. He had ended up in the very platoon my helicopter had been sent to rescue. When the ambush opened up, Tommy had taken 2 rounds to his leg, cutting his femoral artery. He had run blindly into the brush to escape the crossfire, collapsing miles from his unit. He was minutes away from bleeding to death in a jungle that covered thousands of square miles. I ripped my belt off, looped it high around his upper thigh, and cranked it down with all the strength left in my body.
Tommy screamed, gripping my forearms, his fingernails digging through my shirt into my skin. "I got you, Tommy," I sobbed, tears cutting clean tracks through the gunpowder soot on my face. "I got you. You're not dying out here. I'm taking you home." I threw his arm over my neck, lifted his 80-pound frame off the mud, and carried him back through the elephant grass toward the clearing where my wrecked Huey lay smoking. 20 minutes later, the air roared as 2 rescue helicopters spotted our wreck and dropped down through the canopy with winches lowered. The medics pulled Tommy up into the bay of the lead bird, hooking him up to IV lines before his pulse could give out completely. The flight surgeon told me right there on the grass that if that tourniquet hadn't been applied within 10 minutes of the hit, Tommy would have been gone. I sat on the skid of the rescue bird, watching the green canopy of the Ah Shao Valley recede beneath us as we climbed into the cloud cover. Military scientists call it stress-induced auditory hallucination.
They say high-velocity combat creates spatial anomalies in human perception, that the brain calculates trajectory vectors subconsciously and converts them into voices or sudden urges to survive. They have a rational, tactical explanation for everything that happens on a battleground. They can explain ballistics. They can explain physics. But they can't explain how a voice inside my helmet knew a round was coming before it cleared the barrel of an enemy gun. And they sure as hell can't explain how a helicopter, spinning out of control from 3,000 feet, landed in the exact square yard of a 1,000,000-acre jungle required for a brother to save his brother's life. War is full of iron and fire, but every now and then something else walks the field with us.